have gone through the 52nd floor. On page 28, we ask you to read a story called The Thespian. Dave and I have been working with these stories for years, in both classes and doing workshops around the country and the world. And we found that this is probably one of the most challenging stories that are in the 52nd floor. And what I want you to do too is pause for a second and ask yourself, would you want to work for this person, the Thespian? Because we ask this question to a lot of our participants and students, and we get very different answers. And I'll tell you the punchline, since we can't do this since you're not physically present. We typically will take that self-monitoring score that you did in lesson 1, and we then separate people who were low self-monitors, 0 to 9 in one group, and then high self-monitors, 10 to 18 in the other group, and we have them discuss the questions at the end of the Thespian. And when we actually have the open discussion, we find almost exclusively people that are in the low self-monitoring group would never want to work for this person. They think that person's two-faced. And yet on the other side, on the high self-monitors, they said, oh, absolutely, would love to work with this person. And what's fun is to have these two groups then start interacting with one another and try to figure out why the other group just doesn't get it. We were fortunate to do a workshop with a very elite group of government employees. This was a particular group of within the Department of Defense, where you had a group of military officers that had been promoted early to the rank of colonel. And they had been promoted so fast that they were kind of in line to be the next cadre of general officers. At the same time in this room, you had a group of civilian government employees who had also been promoted far ahead of their peers so quickly they were going to be the next group of senior executives. And there's this program where they would bring all these people together, and in this particular group there were about 20. Dave and I are facilitating a workshop on leadership development, and one of the things that we asked them to do was to engage in the story called The Thespian, what you just read. And in this particular group, we also had a senior mentor. In this case, it was a retired 4-star general who had recently retired, was sitting in the back of the room. And that person was there to basically facilitate discussions of what it's like to be at the top of the organizational pyramid as the leader, to facilitate these kinds of discussions and questions throughout the day. Well, we went through the workshop, and then I had asked everybody the question, would you want to work for the Thespian? And nobody's hand went up. And we'd been doing this long enough to usually know how you could prod people to get them to raise their hands, but it was a particular group, and we didn't know it at the time because we didn't give them the self-monitoring test. This was an entire group of low self-monitors. And as I'm trying to get them to, kind of warm up and discuss the story, everybody said, no way, would not work for this person, totally two-faced. And what was interesting, in the back of the room, I'm watching this retired 4-star. Now, up until this point, he had been kind of mildly interested in just, looking around and just listening to the conversation, but I could tell he was becoming somewhat agitated. He leaned forward in his chair, he put his hand on his head, and I could tell he wanted to say something. And nobody in the room was really kind of paying attention to him, so I finally asked him, I said, General, is there something you would like to share with the group? He said, well, I would. Well, he hadn't said anything in an hour, so immediately people pop up, they turned to him, he said, folks, let me tell you something. This Thespian character you're reading about, it's something you're going to have to deal with every single day. He said, whether or not you think you want to be that leader, he said, the fact is, when you're at the top, everybody's looking at you, and your job is you've got to move the organization forward. And the question of whether or not the task is important is largely irrelevant. If it's important to them, it's important to you. And if it's not important to them, it's not important to you. What's important to you as the leader is keeping your eye on the vision and getting the organization to the next stage and facilitating the conversation. And I looked at the general, I said, General, so if I understand you correctly, what you're telling me is when you were a senior leader, you were two-faced? He said, oh, absolutely. I was the Thespian. And they just couldn't get it through their minds how that would be possible. But through the rest of the day, we had this discussion that we would keep coming back to. And you have to ask yourself, are you the leader that you want to be, or are you the leader that your organization needs you to be? That's the fundamental question.